Folks, I've got a co-host today with the Quiet Light Podcast, Mr. Wozniak. Welcome to the Quiet Light Podcast co-hosting duties.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
We've kicked you, Mr. Doused, to the curb. He doesn't listen to the podcast, so I can say that. Mark is gone. He's out. It's just Mr. Wozniak and myself now. Kidding. All kidding aside. He's here forever. He's a lifer. He did found the company, so he should be a lifer. We've got a very special guest for the third time today, folks. It is Stephen Speer from e-commerce lending. Chris, in the past, Stephen and I have talked about, SBA loans for buyers and what they have to do to get one and the benefits of it and the financing aspect and all these different things. Today, we're going to flip the script a little bit and talk about what to do to prepare your business so that you qualify for an SBA loan and you have more buyers available or able to buy your business. What's the upside to having more buyers be qualified to buy your business, Chris?
Well, it's huge. I mean, I tell every seller, if there's any chance we have, let's try to get you SBA pre-qualified because, you're talking about a much smaller pool of buyers that may need all cash to buy your business. If we can find buyers that need maybe 10 or 20% down to buy your business, you can imagine the pool of buyers expands dramatically. So if we can get you pre-qualified, it's a huge win out of the gate. And there's just so many nuances to getting your business prepped to get pre-qualified. So I really strongly urge any seller that's thinking about it, that really doesn't know what the SBA is and doesn't know what lenders are and how that's all intertwined, to just take 30 minutes and listen.
Yeah, I agree 100%. If you want to get maximum value for the business, prepping it to be SBA qualified or pre-qualified is going to open up to more buyers, and the more buyers that are interested in your business and can buy your business, the closer you're going to be to your financial goals, and definitely get a better deal structure in most cases. So let's go to it. Let's jump to the podcast with Mr. Speer. Here we go, folks.
Stephen, welcome back to the Quiet Light Podcast. How are you doing?
Doing well, Chris. Thanks for having me back.
Absolutely. Great to have you on.
Absolutely. Yeah. Chris, good to have Stephen back for what, the third time, Stephen, I think?
It is a third time. I think the first was 2017 or 16, maybe.
Yeah. You were one of the early guests on the podcast. That was a long time ago. I had less gray hair back then. I think it was taller too, but nobody can tell.
Still super handsome, though, Joe.
I think I was 20 pounds lighter.
We've all changed. And that's why we've got Wozniak on the podcast here, folks, because he's younger and better looking than Stephen and I. And we needed to bring some, fresh blood here for you younger entrepreneurs that are just looking at us old guys going, what do these guys know? But listen, this is what we're going to talk about today. We've had Stephen on in the past talking about, preparing, how to buy a online business with an SBA loan, something that was critical back in 17, all the time, actually, because the deal structures changed. And now with the aggregators, it seems harder and harder to buy an online business and fight against the aggregators because they're jumping on stuff really fast and can pay all cash. As Chris and I has always said, it's an extra 45 days maybe to wait, 60 days to wait to close. And there's two upsides to it. The SBA loans, 90% of them close. And I know you have to wait an extra 60 days maybe, but the upside to that is that you also get an extra 60 days worth of revenue and profit, plus probably a better deal structure. And we'll get into that a little bit because today's podcast is actually about how to prepare your business for the SBA loan process so that you can have a broader base of buyers, whether it's an aggregator for an FBA business. They are going to content sites and Shopify stores now, or DTC stores, but also for any kind of business, whether you're SaaS or content or e-commerce, to just make sure you're going to get maximum value on the best deal structure when you sell your business. Now, Stephen, on this podcast, we're going to talk about this a little bit more, but why don't you give us a general overview of how to prepare a business for, thinking, or why somebody should prepare the business or think about preparing it for the potential SBA buyer?
The main thing is the key word is prepare, as opposed to just, I want to sell my business. it's all about preparation, not only from the aspect of selling the business, but also to set the business up for a successful exit and be able to essentially have the largest net profit at the largest check possible upon exit. And part of that is to be able to position the business in a way that when you go to exit, it qualifies for financing. Ultimately, especially at the higher price points, it's very rare to have individual or even a collective group just stroke a check for an acquisition of a business that's, $1 million, $2 million, $3 million.
Is it that's your definition of a higher price point? Is that 2, 3, 4 million range? Is that what you're thinking?
I'm sorry?
You said on that higher price point, and then you actually defined it for me, but you're thinking, 2, 3, 4 million would be where you think we start to see not all cash deals?
Right. Excluding, the aggregators that you mentioned earlier.
Well, some of them fight for, they say all cash, Chris, right? But then in their emails, Stephen, say all cash, we'll pay all cash. I've even seen one that says we'll pay all cash. And if you're under LOI with somebody else, we'll beat that by $250,000. And we were under LOI with that aggregator on a deal, and they did not pay all cash, and they were haggling in due diligence like crazy. None of it was math and logic. It was just doing it for the sake of doing it. And so what they say is not always the truth. So with SBA loans and SBA deals, you may end up with a much better deal structure, like mostly cash, I guess is what you're getting at, Stephen, right?
Exactly. And also, aggregators definitely played their part, but at the end of the day, you want to open up your business to as many potential buyers as possible. It's supplying, basic supply and demand. The more buyers, generally it pushes the price point up. And that's why it's important to position your business for exit from a financing perspective. And unfortunately, most sellers don't do that. They, back to a couple of points you made, for example, in your book, they just decide to sell and they're really not ready to sell. They haven't prepared for exit. And usually that takes time, right, Joe?
I wrote a book. What book are you referring to? Oh, wait, I did.
Yeah, this book right here.
Just for clarification, though, Chris, I'm no Walker Dybel, right? I haven't done what Walker's done.
No one is.
Have you seen him lately, Stephen?
No,
he looks like
he's on permanent sabbatical.
No. He's going out to shows and events, and he looks like he's auditioning for a role in a Tarzan movie. His hair is so long and down here. Anyway, sorry. I know, Walker, that you don't listen to this. Somebody might have the clip and be sharing it with you, but you're fun to make fun of. Yeah. You got to position the business for sale. I'm sorry, Chris, go ahead.
So I was going to say, just Stephen, kind of taking a step back, one thing I've kind of noticed, which is strange with my sellers is, and it's made me kind of reflect on how I'm proposing SBA financing to them. But one question I kind of get or a theme is, and I've realized this, is a lot of sellers, when I kind of talk about SBA financing, I realize they don't understand exactly what it is, like from a real basic premise. So like they'll say things to me like, what is SBA financing? I think I'd much rather get cash at closing. And it's like they're thinking that some type of loan where they're not going to get cash at closing. And I've realized I have to explain this better, like really, because they have no clue what the SBA financing is. And they also think they're getting money from the SBA, which is not true either. What would you say to sellers? I know the answer, but what would you tell sellers to educate them on that?
I think the key is just telling them that it's essentially a buyer obtaining a loan to acquire their business. And the loan's not from the SBA. The loan's from a lender who happens to have the loans partially guaranteed by the SBA, Small Business Administration. So oftentimes, and that's kind of something that comes up quite a bit in conversation that we have here at e-commerce lending, is that they think that the loan's coming from the SBA, and it's not. So it's essentially a loan coming from a lending institution that happens to be guaranteed or insured against default. But at the end of the day, the seller does get a sizable check at closing with a lot fewer strings attached than maybe an aggregator type deal. So it's really a win-win. And generally they get more money at closing. So if they're willing to wait an extra, as Joe mentioned, 45 days to exit, it's most people would do that for an extra couple of $100,000.
Yeah, let me say a couple of things first. In regards to aggregators, I'm going to agree with you, Stephen. They've been very good for the market, folks. They've really exposed the idea of being able to sell an online business so much better than we have. We've been around for 14 years. These guys have been around for 4, and now everybody knows you can buy an online business or an FBA business. That's something we struggled to get across people's minds for a long time. And second, Chris, as far as the, hey, I'd rather get cash at closing than do an SBA deal. I've come across the same thing. And it's almost like when you see a piece of, some real estate for sale, or you're selling your home, and, somebody comes to the table and they're making an all cash offer. Well, at the end of the day, that person that's, making an offer with financing, it's all cash as well. It's exactly the same. The only difference, there's 2 differences. One, probably the all cash offer is lower than the other offer because they literally are using all of their cash. That's the downside. The upside is, with a loan offer. The only other issue that people have great fears about, Stephen, is that, like with real estate, that person wouldn't be approved for the loan. But with your process, you get everybody pre-approved. And that's what we do at Quadlight. Chris, you would never go under LOI without, on an SBA deal without having the buyer pre-approved already from a lender like Stephen, correct?
Yeah, the buyer and the seller pre-qualified for sure. Yeah.
All right, Stephen, let's get right on track into how to, what things you've got to do to prepare your business to get the best value on an SBA loan. So give us some idea on what entrepreneurs, owners of businesses can do today to make sure that when they do go to sell, that they'll be able to qualify for an SBA loan.
And to answer your question, I think, what are the biggest challenges in that happening? One, books that aren't clean books. The financials are a disaster. And unfortunately, we see that quite a bit. And I think primarily because sellers, when they establish, let's just say an FBA business, Amazon business, it's kind of more of a mom and pop, extra revenue stream kind of approach. And then it just evolves over time. And they really get behind the 8 ball with their financials, be it their P&Ls and balance sheets and tax returns. And that's the biggest challenge from a lending perspective, is that oftentimes the financial information provided by the seller to us is a disaster. So what we try to do is...
What's your definition of disaster, though? Are we talking about people that just don't do a good job in QuickBooks, or they commingle 3 different businesses in one, LLC and tax return? I mean, that's always hard, commingling of financials. How do you deal with separating those out? If somebody's done that and they've got a business that's 4 years old and another that's 6, and they're trying to sell the older one, but it's all under one LLC, one tax return, is that even sellable with an SBA loan?
It is. And that's, I would say, in terms of ranking, that's one of the biggest problems. That's the biggest problem, is commingling of businesses. So you have a seller with...
What do they have to do if it's too late to fix that? If they're ready to sell now, and the best buyer is an SBA buyer, what do they have to do, and when do they have to do it?
Well, if they have to sell immediately, that's not going to happen from a financing perspective. But if they have a little bit of time, they hire a CPA and they start having their financials delineated into what's called consolidated financials, meaning the revenues and expenses of each business. Each of the businesses are delineated onto kind of a formal format by a CPA, not a bookkeeper, but by a CPA. And then from that standpoint, we're able to move forward. And we have quite a few deals that we've had to intercede and get in there and help that CPA along the process. But at the end of the day, those deals ended up getting approved and closed.
Yeah, I'll speak. Sorry, Joe.
Yeah, go ahead, Chris.
Okay. I was going to say, I'll speak to that. I've given, Stephen and I have done a handful of deals this year, and I've given you some doozies on about half of those, Stephen, that had pretty complicated financials. Even the last deal we just closed, and you were able to help kind of guide us with kind of a template for the letter of delineation, and then kind of an accompanying spreadsheet that gave you the visual of what the letter of delineation was trying to explain. So it is, I'm speaking from firsthand experience. It is possible, and Stephen's gotten them done where the financials were not exactly clean. So,
and that letter from the CPA, when they delineate everything, happens after being under letter of intent, and it just adds to the amount of time and due diligence and ultimately to closing, Stephen?
Well, what we do is when we pre-qualify a business, we've pre-qualified several of Chris's businesses. We're told, hey, just so you know, there is commingling, and then Chris will provide us with P&Ls that have that delineation. And that's a good starting point, be able to pre-qualify the business with the understanding that once we do go under LOI, a formal consolidated financial statement needs to be provided by a CPA. So any broker knows that, and any seller knows that once he or she's under LOI, that they need to, hire a CPA and have those financials formally delineated.
Yeah, we did it with Ramon's business years ago when we sold it as well. Yeah. And everybody's heard the story about Ramon in terms of his exit. Chris, you've never had a P&L with, a lot of add backs in it, right? People don't write things off in Q4 when they're buying Christmas presents for the family, right? You've never seen those, have you?
Never seen a tax return on cash basis. Never seen that before either. So, yeah.
Yeah. So they're all kind of messy and a little, it is what it is. But, one of the things that I learned early on, Stephen, in working with you is that your team will actually, and actually in underwriting, they'll do a little bit of an add back schedule it's not the bottom line number on the tax return necessarily. Sometimes there are some pretty crystal clear add backs that you can adjust for as well. Right. And that's the second biggest problem, is when somebody's writing off everything they could possibly write off in the business, and it dramatically lowers their tax burden, but also makes the business less sellable. How do you address some of those issues?
I mean, you're right. So it's not just the bottom line number on the tax return. We do have quite a few add backs, especially in the online space. And oftentimes we have a discussion with the broker of what those add backs may be to be able to utilize those. And you're right. Sellers get really aggressive with their tax returns. They run every single personal expense through them. So it's our job, with the seller's help and sometimes even a CPA, to really start figuring out what those add backs are and be able to add them back. Sometimes actually we've had it where we've consulted a seller with his or her CPA and actually amend their return. It's not entirely uncommon for us to do that, to say, listen, I know you're aggressive. I know you may have to write a check to the IRS, but this might really work out well. I mean, back to your point, that you've always said, choose your pain, and ultimately, if you're willing to write a check to the IRS, but get tenfold out the back when you go to sell a business, most people would do that.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I'd love to agree 100% that most people will do that, but oftentimes they're afraid of the unknown, right? An uninformed mind always says no. I used to say ignorant mind, but a few people got insulted by that. So now I say uninformed. But that's the point of having conversations like this. Stephen, other than, cash, there's SBA financing. What other types of alternatives are there for people that are selling an online business? And it does matter, people, if you're the seller of an online business, because you need to prepare your business to be sold to a great buyer at a great price. And that great buyer may be, in need of financing. And so if you've done a good job with, a proper P&L, accrual accounting, as Chris said, and, proper add back schedule with someone like Chris or myself helping you, that's going to help you get to the bottom, line goal that you're trying to shoot for. But are there alternatives to SBA lending, Stephen, or is it in your view and your experience, is that primarily, the alternative to cash?
And that question comes up a lot, Joe, and there really isn't an alternative to SBA financing. The main reason being there's no collateral on these deals. It's simply cash flow lending, and traditional lending requires collateral. So that's the biggest challenge. And so there's no there. You're selling a business based on its cash flow, and you're buying a business based on its cash flow. And generally, there's no collateral involved. So really, it's SBA financing, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. As you know, SBA financing allows for pretty significant leveraging. So, oftentimes we have clients that can pay cash but choose not to because they're looking to build a portfolio of businesses. So if they pay cash for one deal, they're not going to be able to have enough liquidity to buy other businesses. So they do utilize SBA financing to be able to build that portfolio. So there are a lot of attributes to SBA financing, and another attribute is it's very cheap money. So if you're willing to wait a little bit longer for closing, and if the seller is willing to wait a little bit longer, then it's definitely the way to go.
Hey, Stephen, from a borrower's perspective, you mentioned you may have a buyer that has cash where they could actually do the deal with cash, but they choose to leverage their money and use SBA. From a net worth perspective, a buyer's financial situation, what are SBA requirements and limitations from that regard? Because I know we recently did a deal where the buyer was so strong financially, his balance sheet was so strong, and it actually, you'd think opposite, but it actually made the deal a little more difficult at the beginning. So could you talk about that just a little bit?
That's a really good point, Chris. Every once in a while, we have a buyer who is extremely liquid. For example, he's trying to buy a $2 million business and he has $7 million in the bank. That's a problem, because what the SBA does, even though they're not the ones lending the money, they do have their own guidelines. And if they feel you could easily pay cash for a business without major impact to one's lifestyle or otherwise, they won't allow a lender to lend to that person. So every once in a while, we do have that situation. We've had it twice this year. There are ways to navigate through that, which I discuss with buyers, but for the most part, it could cause a problem.
It's kind of crazy to think about. You get $7 million in the bank, but you don't qualify for a $2 million SBA loan. It's, one of the best pieces of advice I ever got was on the golf course, and I was slicing and hooking, and I'm not a very good golfer, just to be clear, but it was from Walter, and it's my wife's uncle. He's been my mentor for years, very successful entrepreneur. But he said, set up a line of credit. If you're in business and you're an entrepreneur, you're going to need a line of credit someday. And you want it already set up when you're ready to take action. And in this case, if you're buying a business, that person that's got $7 million in the bank, he should have all sorts of lines of credit set up, whether it's a HELOC or with the bank or with his investment advisors, whatever it might be. So if you haven't done it already, folks, I'd definitely advise that you do that. Stephen, for sellers, when they want to say, okay, we talked to them about preparing their businesses and getting trained for that exit. And that's why the book is out there. That's why Chris is here to help people with valuations and help them along this journey. SBA wise, what do they do? What do they do to begin that process to make sure their business is qualified for an SBA loan from your point of view?
Yeah, so they'll come to us typically anywhere from 6 months to 2 years prior to exit. And then we request their financials, and we do a pretty significant forensic audit of them and go back with recommendations. And it may be, it may be as severe as, you should consider amending your return to, hey, moving forward from this point forward, be less aggressive on your taxes, run less personal expenses through. It could be a myriad of different things. In some cases, we have people outside the United States wanting to get as much for their business as possible. And in those cases, we recommend them actually domiciling their business here in the United States. We had one seller, he was Australian, and that's exactly what we recommended. He ended up doing it, 3.5 years ago. And he exited last year with a very nice, very nice reward at the end of it all. But part of that planning was for him to take his Australian company and domicile it here in the United States for at least 2 years. And then his business ended up qualifying for SBA financing.
That's a mature entrepreneur right there. Somebody that's going to think that far in advance. Take some time and experience to do that. Chris, how often do you run across folks like that?
Well, Stephen and I just had a call. What was it, Stephen, like a month ago? Our seller was in the UK, and the same thing. He has a very sellable business, but it's just in the UK and we couldn't get it sold. So I'd kind of rolled the idea out about SBA, but it was kind of a long shot and I didn't know how he would react, but he ended up kind of reaching back out to me and said, "Hey, Chris, do you think it's possible if I had, X amount of years of tax returns in the US, do you think we could eventually get SBA financing and get this thing sold?" And I said, "Yeah, I think so, but let's get Stephen on the phone first." Cause I really wasn't sure. I hadn't dealt with a overseas business that had proposed that question to me before. So we got on a phone call with Stephen, and Stephen kind of walked him through it. And yeah, that's the case. 2 years of domiciled US returns, and we can get it pre-qualified. So
what are the hoops to jump through to have a U.S. entity if you're a UK, Australian, New Zealand resident? I see that question on forums, and I see a dozen different answers. What's your view on that, Stephen? How do you recommend people do it?
Well, first off, I never give out tax advice. Obviously, I'm not a CPA, nor am I a CPA in the UK. But I set kind of the guidelines from a lender's perspective, and then they go back to their accountant or CPA, and they're able to get those wheels in motion. It's not as hard as you think, and it's not where they're getting double taxed. There is a way to be able to formulate it where you're not subjecting your business to more taxation. So I don't get in the weeds on that, but I know that we've been successful in being able to consult our seller clients to put that in place and have a successful exit at the end of the day.
So you deflect is what you do. I'm not an attorney. I can't give you that advice. I'm not your bookkeeper. I know that's what we did too. Right. You can't give advice where you're not,
you have to
qualified. I agree.
You have to.
Disclaimers a day. So yeah.
I agree.
And yet, how many legal questions do the two of you get on a daily basis? Probably all the time, right?
Yeah. It's accounting questions too. So
yeah.
Accounting questions, legal questions. And, you could give some sort of opinion, but at the end of the day, I always say, I'm not an attorney or I'm not a CPA.
Yeah. But
here's my opinion, because obviously we don't want to get, I don't play one on TV either. And, obviously we're not in a position to give out legal or accounting advice.
Of course. So if Chris and I are in the valuation process with a company and they want to end up getting the best possible deal at the end of the day, preparing their financials properly would be one of the recommendations. If they don't have an e-commerce bookkeeper, we're going to recommend get an e-commerce bookkeeper and flip your cash accounting to accrual. It's cheaper than a lease on a Tesla, folks. It's so much better than doing it on your own. And actually, I don't know what the lease is on a Tesla. I guess it depends upon the model. It's worth doing. Let me just put it that way. And it's a heck of a lot cheaper than having an in-house bookkeeper. And then that person is going to be able to just hand things off to your CPA, which is going to be great for tax returns. But if you're commingling, then you're going to have your CPA do some work as well. So CPA is going to have to, separate them out, as Stephen mentioned. You're going to need to hire a bookkeeper, preferably e-commerce bookkeeper, and definitely, accrual accounting. Once they've done all that and they've got it buttoned up, Chris and I, Stephen, we know the process, right? We're listening to business and so on and so forth. But what do you see as the next steps for somebody when they're going to list to the business with Quiet Light or any other firm for that purpose, if they want to maximize their exit and get an SBA buyer?
Well, we do that consulting up front, and then it's kind of ongoing during, let's just say they do it a year out. It's ongoing. And then at the end of it, then we pre-qualify the business, formally issue a pre-qualification letter. So a Quiet Light broker can put it in with the business summary. and list that business as an SBA qualified business. And a lot of buyers, one thing I will say, a lot of buyers, when they look through those CIMs, they look for that SBA eligible or SBA approved indication on the CIM. They do look for that. And oftentimes, if it doesn't have that, they'll move on to the next business. So it really kind of, it draws buyers to your listing if you have that listed.
Yeah, I agree. We start putting it right at the on the teaser, right, Chris? So that people see it online, and if they're simply looking for SBA pre-qualified businesses, they'll see it right on the listing page. Chris, if you've got something that's SBA pre-qualified versus not, have you tracked the volume of downloads of the CIM and the number of LOIs versus none, or number of calls that you have with buyers? Just ballpark numbers. Would it be?
Yeah, I don't have specific stats, but anecdotally, I'd say it's two or 3 to 1 for SBA pre-qualified versus not.
Wow.
Yeah. And so what I explained to all my sellers, if we can get you pre-qualified, it's a very basic thing. It opens up the pool of buyers tremendously, because if it's $1 million business, you can either be looking for the one buyer that has $1 million cash. And if you do find a buyer that has $1 million cash, it seems like they want to leverage their money and buy a business that's $5 million. They don't want to pay cash for $1 million company, at least in my experience. So I explained to sellers, it just opens up your pool of buyers because they may only need 20% down. They may only need 200,000. And Stephen, I was going to ask you, what's your thoughts on, as far as from a borrower's perspective, equity injection? Do they have to come with a certain percentage of cash of the deal to get it done, or can there be other structures that can be considered injection?
There can be other structures that consider injection. I mean, ultimately, the minimum amount that a buyer will have to put up is 10%. There's no way around that. So of his or her own money. And the rest could come in form of a seller note. That's very common. We've had clients where they quite don't have the 10%, but they bring in a business partner that does have it in exchange for an equity stake in the business. So there are ways getting that done. But so that kind of gives you an idea. But in terms of equity injection, the bare minimum allowed or required by the SBA is 10%. But as you move up the food chain, move up to $2, $3, $4 million acquisition, that number does go up. And generally anywhere from a $2 million to a $5 million acquisition, it's going to be anywhere from 15 to 20% buyer injection of the buyer's own money.
Well, this has been great. There's so many different nuances to it for sellers and for buyers. But the most important thing, I think, folks, is that you actually get started so that you don't wake up someday and decide to sell because you're just emotionally spent and you need to get out. Because at that point, it is too late in most situations to get maximum value, to find the best buyer, if the best buyer is an SBA buyer and you haven't done this work in advance. So both buyers and sellers can reach out to you, Stephen, to get themselves pre-qualified as a buyer, or the seller, if you want to send Stephen your details and see if your business is already pre-qualified. If not, he'll tell you what to do and how to fix it. Same with Chris, same with myself. They know how to reach us, Stephen. How do they reach you and connect with you if they want to get their business pre-qualified for an SBA loan?
Well, they can email me at Stephen, and that's Stephen with a PH, at ecommercelending.com. That's on the seller side. On the buyer side, they could either email me at that same email address or go onto our website and schedule a call with one of our team members. And that's
ecommercelending.com, right?
It is indeed, yes.
All right. We'll put that in the show notes as well. Chris, any last questions you want to ask Stephen, or are we good to go here?
I think we're good. Well, can I ask one more question?
Of course. It's your show.
Sure.
So, Stephen, can you talk a little bit from a seller's perspective as we get towards the end of these deals and they're getting close? What's your thought on the bulk transfer requirements from the lenders and the kind of the no tax due certificates? Because sometimes as we're getting closer toward the end of the deal, those certificates and those transfers and getting things back from the state, they can add 10, 15 business days to the deal. Is there anything sellers can do kind of ahead of time? I mean, I know it's the lenders ask for that at the time they ask for it for a reason, but is there anything they can do preparation wise to kind of plan for that?
Yes. And we preach this, right at LOI, start working on that. Unfortunately, we say that, but oftentimes sellers kind of drag their feet and don't get it done. But we front load it right at LOI, start working on that, because that is coming up more and more on deals, and it can delay deals, as you and I know firsthand, Chris. But especially if it's the state of California, they're way behind the 8 ball right now. So yeah, bulk sale transfers, get your attorney involved, get that going immediately upon LOI, and there shouldn't be any issues.
Yeah. Just to require, right?
I was going to say it was California last time I had an issue with that. There's so many issues with you, California. Just get in line and straighten out. Come on, you're making our lives difficult here.
Good luck with that.
It's like with everything else, don't delay, don't wait. Right. Don't put it off until someday. You're going to wake up and someday is here and it's going to be too late. So sellers, reach out to Stephen at ecommerce lending, or go to ecommercelending.com. You can find him there. You could even probably find him on LinkedIn, but of course we'll put it all in the show notes as well. Stephen, I appreciate you joining us once again on the Quiet Life podcast. We'll see you at the next event.
It's been a pleasure, Joe and Chris. Thanks for having me on.
See you, Steve. Good talking to you.